reasonable to make a noise like a chimp in a poem? What does gibberish have to do with creative writing? And what the fuck is sound poetry? In my humble opinion, most poetry is failing to do anything original with speech. The voice is the oldest and most primal media through which language publishes itself. And yet, most people who make an art form out of language rely on a very narrow bandwidth of expressive potential. In this podcast, I will sketch an anatomy of sound poetry, as well as the artistic and even philosophical implications that it raises for writers and performers. I'm going to be drawing on my own research and writing on performance poetics, and also my own craft as a spoken word poet and as a sound poet as part of that, actually. So I'm going to be asking why sound poetry has been such a central part of the human experience as a language-mediated species. Going to be looking also at what it's doing now and why it forces us to completely reassess what poetry is. So these are big questions. This is part of a series where I explore the relationship between performance, language, and the psyche. So if you're into any of those things, hopefully you'll find something to geek out on in this lecture. Big thank you to all of my Patreons for the support that makes this possible. Please take a moment to check out that Patreon link if you haven't already, and to subscribe to the channel that you're seeing this on would be a great help, actually. So sound poetry is vocal sound art that emphasizes the musical features of language. Using sound poetically can also be called Musopoeia. I'm going to put the spelling of this in the blurb below. Musopoeia is where sound itself is used to create the semantic architecture of a poem, which is to say that sound becomes one of the main ways that a poem structures its meaning. And yet we're not looking at music here. It's not song. This is a very subtle distinction. What we're looking at is language that explores and plays with the possibility of the human voice to make sound. Sometimes, for example, I will write something that is intensely rhythmic. Maybe parts of it slip into rap, song, beatboxing. But when I try to add it to music, it becomes muddy and it becomes cluttered. Yeah, I put it all together and I get brown. So this is the litmus test for me. When I've written a highly musical piece of spoken word that refuses both to be written down or to play second fiddle to music, I know I've written a sound poem. It's not a conventional piece of speaking, and it's not song either. It's sound poetry. So that's a little bit about the nature of sound poetry, but defining the how of sound poetry might actually be easier than defining the what of sound poetry, because there is a vast and variegated world of sound poetry out there. It might be freestyle, it might be scripted, it might have text, it might not have text. When sound poets write their poems down, they often do it in really elaborate graphic representations. And there's a whole world of that out there, and I don't have time to go into now. But there are correlates of sound poetry in literature that similarly disobey the rules of written speech, mutating the form and breaking all the rules. And I would say breaking all the rules is a central tenet of what sound poetry is as well. Sound poetry might use existing words differently. It might make new words up completely. This is the poetic device of neologisms. Neologisms from neologos, literally new words, invented words. Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky is one of the most famous examples of this in the English language, but the sound poets really make this into a complete art form in and of itself. In the 1950s, for example, in France, the letterist poets would break words up into their constituent parts and use the letters or even just pure noise, syllables, or even, the rasping, grunting, stuttering, whispering, clicking your mouth, making guttural hacks, allowing all of this to become the material that makes up the poetry. And in fact, all sound poetry exists on a continuum between words on one hand and noises on the other. In the words of the noise poet Olkar E. Linsan, your throat is a noise machine. And if you've seen beatboxing, which I'm sure you'll have, you'll know that the potential of the human voice to make random noises is massive. And indeed, beatboxing, I think, is where today the most innovative vocal sound art is happening. And it's happening with some really badass stagecraft as well. And it's really building on the tradition that we're looking at here. As social mammals, we have evolved complex communicative repertoires and the need to mimic the noises of other animals in our environment. Unlike our closest living relatives, the chimps and the bonobos, we have evolved to have a dropped larynx, which is lower in the neck, gives us greater movement and dexterity to manipulate our vocal folds and our breath. So the human voice is perhaps the most versatile noise machine of any animal. And if we are artists who are dealing with language, I think this deserves to be fully exploited, or at least understood more than it is. Incidentally, sound effects that we make with our voice are called ideophones. Ideophones, and they're musical and they're metaphorical and they're symbolic and they're every bit as poetic as any other device. Especially if we consider poetry within the long breath of the oral tradition, which is a flag I'm constantly trying to fly. Another really important point to make is that sound poetry primarily is a performance discipline, right? Today you get people hybridizing spoken word with rap and beatboxing and pretty much anything else. A century ago, you would get Dada poets who were having bawdy, anarchic cabarets where poets would be waving sticks over the heads of the audience. Right, this is called brutalist poetry, whilst they were performing poems, and the audience would be throwing vegetables at the poets and even trying to attack them. Right, if anyone's interested in this really colourful history, check out Olkar Linson's talk in the show notes below for more on this. So there are loads of examples of random performance experiments in sound poetry that disband the myth of poetry as a contemplative, meditative activity. For example, Alison Knowles has conducted a choir of people reading from newspapers. That's in recent years. In the 1960s, Jason McLowe would screech like a seagull. Around about the same time, 1950s, 1960s, Brian Gysin and William Burroughs would make complete 5-minute poems with just 3 words. Check out I Am That I Am for an example of this. So it's another good video on YouTube called 3 Permutations, which is another good one. Sound poetry might be a cappella. It might use technology. In the mid-20th century, when reel-to-reel tape recorders came into existence, sound poets jumped on that and said, how can we use this technology to evolve what poetry can do? And they were layering and they were distorting the voice. Similarly, today, as a direct evolution of that, you've got poets like Rika Scheffler and Hanna Silva using digital loop stations, digital hardware and vocal processors in their poems. It's something I'm also doing myself, and it's a lot of fun. I would also add vinyl scratching of vocal samples to this list as well. So we've got loads of variety there, massive amount of variety. The one thing that can be said to draw all of these examples together is that sound poetry, in the words of Hanna Silva, makes language strange. And in doing so, it temporarily alters human consciousness. In the tradition of shamanic chanting, right, going beyond language to evoke, to change the brainwaves and the frequency, using the voice, that most ancient of human instruments, to alter human consciousness. Sound poetry disrupts, it disfigures, it deranges language, it goes beyond it completely. Now, for this reason, I would also, and I know this will be controversial, but I would admit ASMR videos, which are now all over the internet, to the canon of sound poetry. Although ASMR doesn't call itself sound poetry, it does very often use the voice, whispering, blowing, exhaling into a microphone to stimulate responses in the body. This process is known as audio-tactile synaesthesia, and it's very much in the tradition of sound poetry. ASMR recordings, things like loud chewing, crunching, slurping, biting foods, drinking drinks, and creating audio tracks out of it, is used to alter human consciousness. So sound poetry is often described as avant-garde or experimental. Very often it's associated with art house performance types, as well as rather obscure academics. Sound poetry often has come out of other areas of artistry, like music, painting, or performing arts. People who are not schooled in the conventions of what poetry should be. Historically, sound poetry's desire to mutate language has made it popular among political subversives. So we've got all of these kind of fringy kind of people making up the canon of sound poetry, as well as people who just want to disturb the genteel niceties of poetry. And I would respectfully submit my own work to that proud tradition. But I would challenge this idea that it is experimental and that it is avant-garde, even though this is a label that many sound poets would give themselves. Actually, I think that sound poetry is, in one sense, is quite conservative, because it's getting back to very ancient ways of using the voice. We talked about evolution earlier. Evolutionarily, verbal communication predates language. So as hominids, for many, many millions of years, we've had verbal communications before we had complex vocabulary and grammar. So sound poetry predates all language, or at least what we understand language to be today. A rhythm, a melody, a timbre, all delivered within the vocal patter that has mediated apes for time immemorial. This desire to transcend any particular language is a philosophical thread that runs through the history of sound poetry, and it's called Transrationalism. Transrationalism. Poets like Stephen McCaffrey describes this desire to push language beyond itself as an attempt to tap into what he calls the primal drives of the unconscious. So to conclude, there is much more that we can do with the voice, because we live in a literate society that fetishizes text. Most poetry is only scratching the surface of itself. If we believe that it is poetry's duty to do language differently, we can go further in our attempts to break the rules of syntax, grammar, vocabulary, performance. We don't have to be immersed in the confines of the dictionary. So it is reasonable to make a noise like a chimp in a poem. Gibberish has got everything to do with creative writing. And given that we are living through an age of collapse, dear friends, why not let's use all of the weaponry of the human voice to disturb, to charm, and to enchant? This podcast is really just a discussion, and I encourage anyone listening to use YouTube to dive in to the world of sound poetry to see just how expansive, far out, and fun it is. 3 poets that I really, really love and have been a big influence on my work: Traci Morris, that's Traci with an I, Hanna Silva, Silva with an A, and David J. Pujilist, J with a J. In the blurb below, I've pasted some playlists that have really helped my research. There are also show notes with references to other poets and writers I've mentioned. As I say, please take a moment to check out my Patreon link and consider supporting me in whatever way you can. You get a bunch of free shit from me, including my book, including my books, plural. Please like, share, comment, subscribe would be a big help to this project. Thank you for listening.